Imagine discovering a horrifying family secret that drives a preacher to cut off his father's manhood in a fit of rage. A twisted betrayal shatters everything he believes in, and a lifetime of trust is destroyed in an instant. This is the story of a man whose faith and family were everything, until a brutal truth turned his world upside down. Before we dive deeper into this chilling tale, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories from the darkest corners of human nature.
Pastor Elijah King, 42,
was the embodiment of devotion in his Florida community. Known for his fiery sermons on faith, family, and moral values, Elijah's ministry drew hundreds of followers who saw him as a beacon of righteousness. His dedication to his church and his family earned him admiration, with many viewing him as the living example of the virtues he preached. Naomi King, 38, was the perfect
counterpart to Elijah. Graceful and composed, she balanced her roles as a preacher's wife and the dedicated mother of their 5 children, Abigail, 16,
Jr., 14, Noah, 12, Sophie, 9, and Micah, 6. Naomi's presence in the community was constant, leading Sunday school, organizing charity drives, and supporting Elijah's ministry at every step. Together, they presented the image of a family blessed by faith, living a life others could only aspire to. At the heart of their spiritual foundation was Deacon Henry King, Elijah's 65-year-old father. A respected elder in the church, Henry had spent decades serving as a deacon and a moral compass for the congregation. His influence on Elijah's upbringing was profound. From a young age, Henry had instilled in his son a deep reverence for God, a commitment to family, and an unwavering adherence to Scripture. Elijah often credited his father during sermons, praising him as the rock upon which their family had been built. The King household was vibrant with activity. Abigail, 16, was thoughtful and academically driven, often helping with church youth programs. Elijah Jr., 14, was reserved but attentive, always eager to lend a hand during church services. Noah, 12, was the family's curious and playful spirit, while Sophie, 9, was known for her sensitivity and eagerness to please. The youngest, Micah, 6, was the light of the family, doted on by everyone and blissfully unaware of life's complexities. Sunday dinners at Henry's home were a cherished family tradition. These gatherings often began with scripture readings and heartfelt prayers led by Henry himself, followed by lively discussions about the church and community. For Elijah, these moments were a source of pride, a symbol of the strong bond that connected the King family and their shared dedication to their faith. One evening at dinner, the King family sat gathered around their oak dining table, enjoying a rare moment of laughter and togetherness. Abigail, their eldest at 16, spoke up with excitement in her voice. "For my genealogy project at school, I thought it'd be fun if we all did a DNA test. We can find out about our ancestry, maybe even find distant relatives." Her younger siblings EJ, 14, Noah, 12, Sophie, 9, and Micah, 6 buzzed with excitement, chiming in with their guesses about hidden royal bloodlines or mysterious family origins. Elijah, always supportive of his children's pursuits, smiled warmly. "That sounds like a great idea. It'll be something we can all do together." Across the table, Naomi's smile faltered. She reached for her glass of water, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know, Abby," she said softly. "These things aren't always accurate, and they can be invasive." Her voice trailed off as she glanced at Henry, who was seated at the head of the table, his usual stern expression unchanging. "Come on, Naomi," Elijah said, brushing off her hesitation. "What's the harm? It's just a fun family activity, and it'll be good for Abigail's project." He reached over and placed his hand over hers, offering her a reassuring smile. "We've got nothing to hide." Naomi looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before nodding slowly. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The children cheered as Elijah pulled out his phone to order the DNA kits. Henry gave a tight smile but said nothing, sipping his coffee in silence. A few weeks later, the results arrived. Abigail eagerly gathered everyone around the computer as Elijah logged into the website. The room buzzed with excitement as they explored the report's ancestral origins, historical connections, and distant relatives. But as Elijah scrolled through the results, his brow furrowed. Something didn't add up. "Wait," he said, leaning closer to the screen. "This says I'm not a match to any of the kids as their biological father." He laughed nervously, shaking his head. "That's obviously a mistake. Probably some kind of database error." Naomi froze, her hand tightening around the edge of the chair. Henry's gaze flicked to Elijah, his face calm but his jaw visibly clenched. "I'll reach out to the company," Elijah said, his voice firm but composed. "They probably just mixed up the data." He stood from the table and kissed Naomi on the top of her head. "Don't worry about it. I'll get it sorted out." Over the next few days, Elijah contacted the genealogy company, pointing out the error in their report. He explained the issue in detail, confident they'd come back with a correction. But when their response arrived, it left him reeling. "We've triple-checked the results," the company representative explained over the phone. "There's no mistake. The children's biological father is someone other than you, and the markers match another close relative within your submitted samples." Elijah's heart sank. He asked them to confirm again, but the answer remained the same. Hanging up the phone, he sat in stunned silence. The only possible match within the submitted samples was his father, Henry. The weight of the revelation crushed him. His mind raced back to subtle moments: Henry's frequent visits, the way Naomi had grown quiet whenever he was around, her initial resistance to the DNA test. It all began to make horrifying sense. That evening, Elijah returned home, clutching the printed DNA results. Naomi was in the living room, folding laundry. He threw the papers onto the table, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice cold and sharp. Naomi's eyes darted to the papers, then to Elijah. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The DNA results," Elijah snapped. "They're saying I'm not the father of my children. But they also say there's another match in our family. Care to explain that?" Naomi's face paled as she clutched the back of the chair for support. There must be a mistake," she stammered. "That can't be right." Elijah leaned closer, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me, Naomi. I went back to the company. They verified it. There's no mistake. So, I'll ask you again. Explain this." Naomi broke down, tears streaming down her face as she sank into the chair. Through sobs, she confessed to a dark secret she had kept buried for years. Early in their marriage, Henry had coerced her into a sexual relationship. His influence and authority made her feel powerless to resist, and the abuse had continued for years. "All 5 of them," Naomi whispered, her voice breaking. "They're all his. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to destroy you, Elijah." Elijah staggered back, the room spinning around him. The woman he loved, the father he revered, they had shattered his life in the most personal and devastating way imaginable. He stormed out of the house, his mind a storm of rage, betrayal, and disbelief. Elijah King sat alone in his car that night, the weight of Naomi's confession pressing down on him like a physical force. His mind raced, each thought darker and more chaotic than the last. The life he had built, his faith, his family, his ministry, had been a lie. His children, his pride and joy, were not his. His wife, the woman he had trusted above all, had been trapped in a horrifying secret. And his father, the man who had raised him, guided him, and taught him to live by God's word, was a monster. The emotions came in waves: shock, pain, disbelief, then anger so blinding it took his breath away. Elijah gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Tears streamed down his face as he shouted into the empty car. "Why? How could they do this to me? He slammed his fists against the dashboard, the frustration boiling over. He drove aimlessly for hours, the streets of his quiet Florida town empty under the moonlight. Memories of family dinners, sermons about forgiveness, and the moments he thought defined his perfect life flooded his mind, now tinged with betrayal. Everywhere he turned in his thoughts, he was met with lies. As dawn broke, Elijah found himself parked at the edge of a lake, staring out at the water. In the stillness of the morning, his pain began to transform into something colder, sharper, vengeance. The betrayal was too great to forgive, the wounds too deep to heal. In his mind, there was only one way to bring justice to the situation. His father and his wife needed to pay for what they had done. Elijah began to plan, the clarity of his thoughts startling him. He had spent years preaching forgiveness, but forgiveness was no longer an option. His heart, once full of compassion, now burned with the need for retribution. He replayed Naomi's confession over and over, each word fueling his resolve. When Elijah returned home, he was calm, eerily so. He didn't speak much to Naomi, who had spent the night crying in their bedroom. He couldn't look at his children without feeling a sharp pang of grief, knowing they weren't his, but he still loved them fiercely. That love only deepened his anger. The evening was heavy with tension as Elijah returned home. Naomi sat alone in the living room, her tear-streaked face pale and anxious. She had spent the entire day on edge, dreading the inevitable confrontation. Elijah entered the room silently, his eyes dark and emotionless, a kitchen knife concealed in his grip. Naomi looked up, her face contorting with a mixture of fear and hope. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know you're hurt, but we can." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice low and icy. "Don't you dare try to fix this with words. You've destroyed everything, Naomi. Everything." Naomi stood, wringing her hands as tears began streaming down her face. "I was trapped, Elijah. I didn't know how to stop it. I never wanted to hurt you." Elijah's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through her words like the knife he gripped. "You didn't want to hurt me. You let him violate our marriage, father my children, and sit at our table as if nothing was wrong. You lied to me every single day, Naomi." She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Elijah, I love you. I love you. We can fix this, fix this." Elijah snapped, his rage finally erupting. "This can't be fixed. You've condemned me to live a lie, and now you'll pay for it." With a sudden, savage movement, he plunged the knife into her chest. Naomi gasped, her eyes wide with shock as the blade tore through her body. Elijah's face was devoid of mercy as he pulled the knife out and struck again, this time in her abdomen. The room was filled with the sickening sound of flesh tearing and her anguished cries. Naomi tried to crawl away, her blood pooling on the floor, but Elijah was relentless. Each stab was fueled by years of betrayal and humiliation. "You should have told me the truth," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You should have stopped him." When Naomi finally lay still, her body a lifeless heap on the blood-soaked carpet, Elijah stepped back, panting heavily. The rage inside him didn't subside, it only shifted focus. There was still one more person who needed to face justice. The evening air was heavy as Elijah drove to Henry's house, his grip tight on the steering wheel. His mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and vengeance, the image of his lifeless wife burned into his memory. He had nothing left to lose, and justice, in his eyes, demanded blood. Bursting through the door, Elijah found Henry sitting at the dining table, a cup of tea in hand and his Bible open in front of him. Startled, Henry looked up. "Elijah, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion and a flicker of fear. Elijah didn't respond. Instead, he threw the crumpled DNA results onto the table. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice low and simmering with rage. Henry's eyes darted to the paper and then back to Elijah. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice faltering. "Don't you dare lie to me," Elijah snapped, his hands trembling. "You've been violating Naomi for years, haven't you? You fathered my children." Henry stood, raising his hands as though to calm his son. "Elijah, listen to me. It's not what you think, don't lie." Elijah roared, his voice shaking the room. "You destroyed my family. You're a monster." Before Henry could speak again, Elijah lunged forward, plunging the knife into his father's side. Henry cried out, stumbling backward and clutching at the wound. Blood seeped through his shirt as he tried to steady himself, but Elijah didn't stop. With savage precision, Elijah stabbed him again and again, each thrust driven by years of pent-up rage. Henry collapsed to the floor, writhing in pain, his strength draining rapidly. "You deserve to feel the pain you inflicted on me," Elijah growled, standing over his father. Henry tried to crawl away, his breaths coming in short, desperate gasps, but his body was too weak to respond. Elijah knelt beside him, his voice cold and steady. "This is for Naomi. This is for the years of lies. This is for my children." Gripping the knife tightly, Elijah began the gruesome act of cutting off Henry's manhood. Henry's screams of agony filled the room, his body convulsing as blood pooled beneath him. Elijah's expression was stone-cold, his focus unwavering as he carried out his grotesque retribution. The pain proved too much for Henry. His screams weakened, his body trembling violently before going limp. He exhaled one final, ragged breath and then was silent. Elijah dropped the knife, now slick with blood, and stumbled back, his chest heaving. The room reeked of iron and death, the echoes of Henry's torment still ringing in his ears. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the lifeless body of the man he had once called his father. But there was no relief, no satisfaction, only a hollow emptiness where his faith and family had once been. Elijah walked out of the house, his clothes soaked in blood. Then he sat on the front porch. The quiet neighborhood erupted in chaos when police arrived at Henry's house, responding to frantic calls from neighbors who had heard horrifying screams and crashing noises. The officers, weapons drawn, approached cautiously, expecting resistance. Instead, they found Elijah sitting on Henry's front porch, drenched in blood, his Bible resting in his lap. Elijah's demeanor was chillingly calm. He looked up at the officers as they approached, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said simply, raising his hands in surrender. "God's justice has been served." The officers quickly handcuffed him, their unease palpable. As Elijah was led to the patrol car, one officer cautiously ventured inside the house. What they discovered was beyond words, a scene of unimaginable violence. Henry's body lay in a grotesque state, his chest riddled with stab wounds and his manhood cruelly severed. The pool of blood and the signs of struggle spoke volumes about the brutality of the act. As they placed Elijah into the back seat of the car, he turned to one of the officers. His voice was steady, almost casual. "Naomi," he said. "You'll find her at our house. She betrayed me too." The officers exchanged shocked glances, realizing the full scale of the horrors they were dealing with. Rushing to Elijah's home, they found Naomi exactly as Elijah had described. Her dismembered body lay in the living room, her remains scattered in a gruesome display of rage and methodical violence. Back at the station, Elijah provided a chillingly detailed confession, his voice devoid of emotion. "She lied to me, for years," he said of Naomi. "And my father, he ruined everything I believed in. They had to face the consequences." His calm recounting of the murders stunned the investigators. When pressed on his actions, Elijah simply replied, "They destroyed our family. I just finished what they started." The dual crime scenes, the sheer brutality of the murders, and Elijah's cold composure sent shockwaves through the community. Their once revered preacher had become a figure of terror, leaving a devastating legacy of violence and betrayal in his wake. Elijah's trial drew national attention, a horrifying tale of betrayal, rage, and gruesome vengeance that captivated the public. The courtroom was packed with journalists, onlookers, and members of Elijah's former congregation, all eager to see how the justice system would handle the preacher-turned-murderer. The defense painted Elijah as a man driven to madness by unimaginable betrayal. They called on psychologists to testify about the trauma he endured upon learning the truth about his children's parentage and his father's abuse of Naomi. They described his actions as those of a man pushed past the limits of human endurance. The prosecution, however, focused on the premeditated and brutal nature of the murders, particularly the gruesome mutilation of his father. Prosecutors argued that while the betrayal he suffered was extreme, it could not justify the sheer violence of his actions. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the horrific circumstances against the brutality of Elijah's crimes. In the end, they returned with a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, acknowledging the complexity of the case but bound by the law, sentenced Elijah to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Elijah's children, now orphans, were separated and placed in foster care, each struggling to come to terms with the horrific truths about their family. The once admired King family became a haunting cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how hidden secrets and betrayal can tear even the most devout lives apart. As Elijah was led out of the courtroom in shackles, he carried his Bible tightly in hand, muttering prayers to a God he believed had guided his actions. To the public, he became a symbol of the destructive power of secrets and rage, a tragic figure who lost everything in his quest for justice. Elijah King's descent from a pillar of faith to a figure of horror serves as a chilling testament to the destructive power of secrets and betrayal. This tale reminds us that even the most revered individuals are not immune to the chaos hidden truths can unleash. Do you believe Elijah's actions were the inevitable result of betrayal, or did he cross a line no amount of pain can justify? If this story left you questioning everything, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime cases that unravel the darkest sides of humanity.